Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Tonight, imagine standing on a quiet limestone hill in southeastern Anatolia, long before cities, before writing, before pottery, and before anything that we would recognize as a modern civilization. The air is cool. There is almost nothing around you that looks permanent. No roads cross the landscape. No lights glow in the distance. No walls surround a city. Beyond the low hills, the land stretches beneath a dark sky filled with stars. And yet, beneath your feet, people have been shaping stone. Thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before Stonehenge, and long before written history, human beings gathered here to build something that still leaves us with questions. You are standing at what we now call Göbekli Tepe. The name means something close to Potbelly Hill, but the place itself feels much more serious than its modern name suggests. Around 11,500 years ago, people came to this hilltop and created monumental stone enclosures. They raised enormous T-shaped limestone pillars. Some were several meters tall. They carved foxes, snakes, birds, wild cattle, scorpions, and other animals into the stone. And they did all of this at a moment when human societies were still living through one of the greatest transitions in our history. The world was changing from mobile hunter-gatherer communities toward more settled ways of life. Agriculture was beginning in parts of the wider region, but the simple story we often hear, that farming came first and monumental architecture came later, does not fit Göbekli Tepe very comfortably. The people who built its earliest monumental structures were not living in cities. They left no written explanation of what they were doing. There are no inscriptions telling us why the pillars were carved. No ancient manuscript describes the ceremonies. No builder left behind a plan. So tonight, we have to listen to the stones. And perhaps, if we are patient enough, we can listen to the sky above them as well. Göbekli Tepe lies in Upper Mesopotamia, in what is now southeastern Turkey. The site belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period so distant from our own lives that even the word history becomes difficult to use. There was no writing, there were no metal tools, there were no wheeled vehicles. The communities of this period relied heavily on hunting and gathering. Although the wider region was already experiencing important changes in the management and domestication of plants and animals. That distinction matters. It is tempting to say that Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture. The reality is more complicated. Agriculture did not suddenly appear on a single day. It developed gradually through experimentation, cultivation, settlement, and changing relationships between people, plants, animals, and landscapes. Göbekli Tepe belongs directly within that transformation. The earliest monumental structures at the site date roughly to the 10th millennium BCE, with the great enclosures generally associated with the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. Later, structures continued into the pre-pottery Neolithic B. This means that when the largest stone pillars were being raised, the people living in this region were participating in a world that was still largely unfamiliar with the settled agricultural life that would later define much of the Near East. And that is one of the first things that makes the site so unusual. The old assumption was simple. First, humans settled. Then they developed agriculture. Then they accumulated food, Then they created large societies, and eventually those societies built monuments. Göbekli Tepe does not allow us to tell that story quite so neatly. Instead, it shows us communities capable of remarkable cooperation at an unexpectedly early stage. The stones themselves are the clearest evidence. The famous T-shaped pillars are not simply rough blocks of limestone. Many were carefully shaped. Some were decorated, and several appear to represent stylized human beings. Their long vertical bodies rise from the ground, while their broad horizontal tops resemble heads. On some pillars, carved arms and hands make this interpretation especially interesting. The monuments may therefore have represented beings with human characteristics rather than simply functioning as anonymous architectural supports. But even here, certainty has limits. We do not know exactly what these figures meant to the people who created them. Perhaps they represented ancestors, perhaps supernatural beings, perhaps figures connected with ceremonies or stories that have completely disappeared. The stones remain, the meaning does not. And this is where the animals begin to matter. A fox moves across one pillar. A snake winds across another. Birds appear in different forms. Wild cattle, gazelles, and other creatures are represented with an attention to shape and movement that tells us these were not random decorations. The people who carved them knew the animals around them. They hunted them, they watched them, they lived among them. The imagery reflects a world in which humans were deeply connected to wild animals and to the landscape that supported them. Some pillars also contain arrangements of abstract symbols. One of the most famous is Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. It has become central to one of the most intriguing debates surrounding Göbekli Tepe. Could some of these symbols have been connected with the sky? Could the animals have represented something beyond the animals themselves? Could the people who gathered here have been watching the movements of the sun, moon, and stars? The answer is not known, but the question is serious enough to have attracted researchers working in archaeoastronomy. And this is where we need to slow down, because there is a difference between finding an astronomical possibility and proving an astronomical purpose. That difference is easy to lose when looking at a site as mysterious as Göbekli Tepe. The night sky can seem almost designed for interpretation. Patterns appear naturally. A group of stars becomes an animal. A direction becomes a calendar. A carving becomes a record of an event. Sometimes those connections may reflect ancient intention. Sometimes they may simply be patterns that modern observers are especially good at finding. We cannot assume that every alignment was deliberate. We also cannot assume that every symbol had only one meaning. Archaeology often lives in this uncomfortable space between what we can demonstrate and what we can reasonably suggest. One proposed interpretation focuses on Pillar 43. Researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Sikritsis have argued that some of the imagery may encode astronomical information, including possible references to celestial events and the passage of time. Their interpretation connects certain symbols with constellations and proposes that the pillar could have recorded a significant astronomical event. This is an active interpretation, not an established consensus about Göbekli Tepe. Another study by Sweatman has proposed that the symbols on Pillar 43 may represent a form of lunisolar calendar. Again, This is an interpretation. It is interesting. It is testable. But it is not the same thing as saying that archaeologists have discovered the world's first confirmed calendar at Göbekli Tepe. There are also studies examining the orientation of the enclosures and pillars in relation to celestial objects. Some researchers have proposed possible connections with stars or with the movements of the sun and moon. One study, for example, examined the possibility that the enclosures were oriented toward the rising position of Sirius during the period when the monuments were constructed. Such ideas are fascinating because orientation is one of the few things we can measure directly. The stones have positions. The landscape has directions. The sky has predictable movements. But interpretation still requires caution. A monument can face a particular direction without necessarily having been built for astronomical observation. People may choose orientations for many reasons: landscape, movement, symbolism, ritual, practical construction, or simply tradition. And because Göbekli Tepe was built over many centuries, the sky itself was not exactly the same sky we see today. The positions of stars change over very long periods because of the gradual movement of Earth's rotational axis. That means an ancient alignment cannot simply be compared with a modern night sky and declared meaningful. The date of construction matters. The original position of the monument matters. The exact point from which an alignment was intended to be observed matters. And perhaps most importantly, we need evidence that the people who built the monument actually intended the connection we are proposing. That final piece is often the hardest one to recover. There is another possibility worth considering. Perhaps the sky was important without Göbekli Tepe being an observatory in the modern sense. The two ideas are not the same. A society does not need a telescope, an observatory, or a formal science of astronomy to pay close attention to the heavens. The night sky would have been an unavoidable part of life. For people without artificial light, the stars were not hidden behind a glow of cities. The Milky Way would have been visible. The phases of the moon would have been obvious. The changing position of the sun marked the seasons. The appearance and disappearance of particular stars could have provided useful reference points. Hunters, travelers, and communities living from the landscape would have had practical reasons to notice these patterns. So perhaps the more interesting question is not whether Göbekli Tepe was an astronomical observatory. Perhaps it is whether the sky formed part of the mental world of the people who built it. That is much harder to disprove, and it does not require us to imagine an ancient civilization possessing knowledge far beyond its time. It only requires us to remember something simple. People have always looked up. Long before written astronomy, human beings watched the sky. They noticed the moon. They watched the changing length of daylight. They recognized recurring patterns. They created stories around things they could not control, and they used the heavens to give structure to an uncertain world. At Göbekli Tepe, we cannot recover those stories, but we can see that symbolism mattered. We can see that enormous effort was invested in carving stone. We can see that animals occupied a central place in the imagery. And we can see that these monuments were part of a social world much more organized than the phrase primitive hunter-gatherers might suggest. The excavation record also gives us another important clue. Göbekli Tepe was not simply a collection of isolated stones sitting on an empty hill. Archaeologists have identified monumental enclosures alongside evidence for other forms of activity, including feasting and the processing of wild animals. Recent work has also revealed non-monumental structures that appear to have had domestic functions. This makes the old picture of Göbekli Tepe as nothing more than a mysterious temple increasingly difficult to maintain. The site was part of a living landscape. People came there, they gathered, they ate, they worked, they performed activities that archaeologists are still trying to understand. The monumental structures were embedded within a wider human environment, and that changes the feeling of the place. Imagine the hill thousands of years ago. There is no museum, no wooden walkway, no glass display, no quiet voice explaining the meaning of each object. Instead, there are people moving between the stones. Someone carries food, someone tends a fire, someone works a piece of flint. Children move through the gathering. The smell of smoke mixes with the dry air. Beyond the enclosure, the landscape falls away into darkness. And above everything, the sky remains open. Perhaps someone looks upward. Perhaps they recognize a familiar pattern. Perhaps they simply watch the moon. We do not know. There is something strangely comforting about that uncertainty, because not knowing does not make the past empty. It reminds us that the people who lived here were real. They had no obligation to leave us an explanation. They were not building for an archaeologist 12,000 years later. They were living their own lives. And whatever Göbekli Tepe meant to them, they understood it through a world of beliefs and experiences that we can only partially reconstruct. The site itself also challenges another common idea. We often imagine that monumental architecture requires a state, a king, a bureaucracy, an army of workers, a permanent city. Göbekli Tepe suggests that large-scale cooperation existed in human societies before those institutions became familiar features of civilization. People were capable of organizing labor, transporting stone, planning structures, sharing food, maintaining traditions, and returning to important places. That does not mean Göbekli Tepe was built by a lost, advanced civilization. There is no archaeological evidence requiring that explanation. Nor is there evidence that an unknown outside group arrived and taught local people how to construct the monuments. The remarkable part is that humans already possessed enough social ability to do this themselves. Sometimes the real mystery is less exotic than the legends. It is simply the ability of ordinary human communities to accomplish extraordinary things together. And still, the question of the sky remains. If the builders were watching celestial movements, why? Perhaps the answer had something to do with time. For people living closely with the seasonal landscape, time was not an abstract number on a screen. It was the return of animals, the growth of plants, the changing weather, the lengthening and shortening of days, the arrival of winter, the beginning of warmer seasons, the appearance of familiar stars, the moon becoming full, then disappearing into darkness. A calendar, if one existed here, would not simply have been a mathematical device. It would have been connected to life itself. Some astronomical interpretations of Göbekli Tepe attempt to connect the symbols with seasonal or longer-term celestial cycles. These interpretations remain debated, but they point toward a reasonable possibility. that time and the natural world were closely connected in the symbolic life of these communities. We do not need to decide tonight exactly what every symbol means. In fact, pretending that we can would make the story less interesting, because the stones have survived precisely because they do not explain themselves. They ask us to look, to compare, to measure, to question, and sometimes to admit that we do not know. There is one more part of the story that makes Göbekli Tepe particularly strange. The monuments did not remain open forever. Over time, structures were abandoned and filled. The site changed. Later communities constructed different forms of architecture in the same broader landscape. The monumental enclosures belong to a long period of human activity rather than a single moment. This means there was no single night when someone suddenly built Göbekli Tepe and walked away. It was a process. Generations lived and changed. Knowledge was passed on. Symbols were repeated or transformed. Stones were carved, structures were used, and eventually the place became part of the archaeological record. The people who knew its meaning disappeared. The hill remained. For thousands of years, Göbekli Tepe lay beneath layers of soil and sediment. The world changed around it. Villages became settlements. Settlements became towns. Writing appeared. Kingdoms rose. Empires crossed the region. Languages changed. Religions changed. Cities were built and abandoned. And the people of later ages had no idea what was resting beneath the hill. Then, in the 20th century, archaeologists began to recognize that the landscape contained something unusual. Excavations eventually revealed the monumental structures that would transform our understanding of the Neolithic. The modern archaeological work began in the 1990s under Klaus Schmidt, whose excavations brought international attention to the site. And suddenly, a world that had been silent for thousands of years began speaking again. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to change the questions we ask about human history. Göbekli Tepe is sometimes described as the place where civilization began. That is too simple. It is not a city. It does not provide a single starting point for civilization. Human history did not begin in one location. It developed through countless communities, environments, experiments, migrations, failures, and discoveries. Göbekli Tepe is important for a different reason. It shows us that human cooperation, symbolism, ritual, and monumental construction were already deeply developed at an astonishingly early point in the Neolithic, and it forces us to reconsider the relationship between belief and social organization. Maybe people did not first build complex communities because they wanted cities. Maybe shared rituals, gatherings, stories, food, and places of meaning were themselves part of the process that encouraged people to remain connected. We cannot reduce that process to one cause, but Göbekli Tepe gives us a rare glimpse of humans creating something together before the familiar structures of later civilization had fully formed. And perhaps that is why the night sky feels so appropriate here, because the stars are one of the few things that would have looked familiar to those people. The landscape has changed. The animals have changed. The climate has changed. Human societies have changed beyond recognition. But when darkness arrives, the sky still rises above the hill. Not exactly the same sky, not in exactly the same positions, but close enough to remind us of the continuity of human experience. Someone stood here and looked upward. We cannot know what they thought. Perhaps they saw signs. Perhaps they saw ancestors. Perhaps they saw gods. Perhaps they simply saw a beautiful pattern of light. And perhaps, in some quiet way, that is enough. Because the most interesting thing about Göbekli Tepe may not be that it contains a secret message waiting to be decoded. It may be that it shows how much human beings were already capable of imagining. We tend to think of the distant past as empty, a world of simple tools and simple needs. But the stones tell a different story. They tell us that people could invest years of effort into places whose meanings mattered to them. They could carve animals into limestone. They could organize gatherings. They could remember traditions. They could look beyond immediate survival. And perhaps they could look into the night sky and wonder about the same enormous darkness that still surrounds us. The astronomical theories will continue to be tested. Some may become stronger. Others may eventually be rejected. New excavations may change the picture again. A carving that seems mysterious today may become easier to understand tomorrow, and another may become even more mysterious. That is how archaeology works. The past is not a puzzle with a final answer hidden in one box. It is a landscape slowly becoming clearer, one stone at a time, one layer at a time, one question at a time. So as you imagine Göbekli Tepe tonight, you do not need to imagine a lost civilization with impossible knowledge. You do not need secret astronomers. You do not need forgotten machines. You only need to imagine human beings. People standing on a hill. People carrying stone. People gathering around firelight. People watching animals move through the landscape. People marking time. People looking toward the horizon. And perhaps, when night came, people looking upward. The great pillars would have stood in darkness. Their carved animals would have disappeared into shadow. The limestone would have cooled after the heat of the day. A small fire might have flickered somewhere beyond the enclosure. And above it all, the stars would have stretched across the sky. Quietly, patiently, without explanation. More than 11,000 years later, we are still standing at the edge of that silence. We have learned much about Göbekli Tepe. We know approximately when its monumental structures were built. We know something about the people who created them. We know about the animals they carved. We know that they lived during a profound transformation in human history. And we know that the site cannot be understood simply as a strange monument appearing out of nowhere. But we still do not know exactly what the pillars meant. We do not know precisely why particular animals were chosen. We do not know whether the builders intentionally encoded astronomical information into the carvings. We do not know whether the orientations of the structures were connected with celestial events, ritual directions, landscape features, or several things at once. And we do not know what the people who stood beneath those pillars called the place. Their words are gone, the stones are not. Perhaps that is why Göbekli Tepe continues to feel so strangely present. It does not give us a complete answer. It gives us a moment, a hill, a circle of stones, a dark sky, and the quiet suggestion that 12,000 years ago, someone stood beneath that same darkness and wondered about the world. Tonight, you can let that image remain there. The hill beneath the stars, The old limestone pillars rising quietly from the earth, the animals sleeping somewhere beyond the enclosure, the distant wind moving across the Anatolian landscape. Nothing needs to be solved now. The question can remain a question, and the stones can remain where they have always been, silent beneath the sky, as you slowly leave that ancient hill in your imagination. The night does not have to end. There are other places where the past has left behind questions rather than answers. Other landscapes where people disappeared, leaving only fragments behind. And somewhere beyond Göbekli Tepe, another story is waiting in the darkness, quietly, patiently, for another night.